Hi everyone, welcome to week 2 of Shinto Foundation's festivals and fox shrines. Today we'll be getting towards some of the practices of Shinto, some of the events and things that people in Japan participate in that would fall under the rubric of Shinto. So before we get to that, I wanted to talk about something that came up in discussion this week, and that is the fact that Shinto is oriented more towards this world and what we experience in this world rather than the world beyond, as with some other world religions, Buddhism notably in the case of Japan. So in Shinto, there is actually a heaven and a hell, but it's really for kami more than it is for human beings. So kami, at least many of them, live in a realm called Takamagahara, which translates as high heavenly plane. And again, this is the residence of heavenly kami. So some of the famous kami, like the sun goddess Amaterasu, they reside in Takamagahara. Try saying that 5 times fast. We, us humans, live in the land of reed plains, Ashihara no Nakatsukuni. And not only do we live here, but earthly kami. There is a hierarchy of kami that we'll talk about more once we fully engage in the study of kami. And finally, there's Yomi, which is sort of a hell. It's sometimes described as a polluted land or a land of darkness, and it appears most notably in one of the founding myths of Shinto, that of Izanami and Izanagi, these creator gods, and Izanami, the female creator god, dies and goes to Yomi. So we'll get to that myth shortly, but that's where it's coming from. Now, again, so this heaven and hell is really for the kami only, and even so, there are very few descriptions of either. We don't really know what they look like. They're not depicted. The closest we can get in some ways is this place in Japan, in Shimane Prefecture, which is where Izumo Shrine is. That's supposed to be sort of the gateway to Yomi. That's as close as we get. So this really shows us that in Shinto, there's very little interest in the afterlife. It's not the focus of the tradition at all. So what is the focus? Life. And in some ways that starts with the sort of human life cycle. So Shinto provides a lot of different rituals for, different phases of life from the very beginning, with the Hatsumiya Mairi, literally first shrine visit. Miya is yet another term for shrine. There, as you know already, there are quite a lot of them. Perhaps a little better known is Shichiko-san, which is a festival that's not festival, a ritual that blesses young children of very particular ages. It's either 5 for boys or 3 or 7 for girls, as you can see in the picture up top there. Another thing that Ian Reader didn't mention in your textbook, but I think is also worth mentioning here, are weddings. So you find a lot of different kinds of weddings in Japan today, as in elsewhere, but for about 100 years or so, Shinto weddings were the most common form of wedding in Japan. And even today, you still see them very often going to a shrine. You might come across a scene like this at the bottom right, where you have a couple in wedding finery, a priest and some miko or shrine priestesses in front of them, family in either kimono or suits in back. And then another thing that, we really don't have any sort of great equivalent to is this idea of yakudoshi, or unlucky years. Certain years of your life, certain ages, are supposed to be more unlucky than others, and these differ from men to women. Whether or not you actually believe them is a whole nother story. But of course, there are, prayers you can make, things you can request, talismans you can buy in order to prevent any, particular hardship happening this year's. Now, one of the worst for women is 33, and that's the year I got married, so I don't know if I really believe this, but so it is. And one thing that was notably absent is funerals. And I mention that here because while Shinto funerals do exist, they are relatively new in origin and they are extremely rare. Essentially, only if you belong to a Shinto family will you have one of these, like a Shinto priest family. And that's because, we'll get to this more as we go into history, but Shinto and Buddhism sort of have almost a division of labor when it comes to religion in Japan. So for a very long time, it was common to have a Shinto wedding and a Buddhist funeral. And the Buddhist funeral is still, again, quite common these days. So, at any of these, sort of life events and rituals, ceremonies of these life events, you would find these various components of Shinto rituals. Pretty much all Shinto rituals will have some form of these four items, as pointed out by Ian Reeder in Shinto Simple Guide. So, one we've talked about a good amount already is purification, washing the hands and mouth at those temizuya as you come into a Shinto shrine. In some cases, depending on what the ritual is and what it's for, there might be some more detailed ritual bathing, and that might occur in the sea, considering both salt and water are considered to be purifying forces. It might just be at home, but done in a very sort of specific ritualistic way. And even throwing salt can be a purifying thing. You'll notice that if you ever watch a sumo tournament, they'll throw salt on the ring first. There's often a little bit of salt in front of restaurants and stores in Japan, also again supposed to be for purifying. Giving offerings of some sort is very common. You'll see this on Shinto altars, whether in someone's house or at a shrine. And these can be a variety of things. Sake and rice are among the most important, in terms of two key products of Japan that have, sort of associations with the sacred. Seasonal fruit and vegetables are also very common. And then another thing that is worth keeping in mind is that offerings aren't only particular objects, they can also be performances. The kami very much like to be entertained. So that can be dance in the form of kagura, as you see in the image at the bottom right. Or, kagura also has music. There's specific court music called gagaku that you'll often hear at shrines. And even forms of theater. There are particular shrines in Japan, notably Itsukushima, a very famous shrine on Miyajima, an island outside Hiroshima, that has a no theater stage. And occasionally, and it's a stage that goes out over the water, and no is performed there as an offering to the kami. And this seems obvious, but it's worth mentioning. Prayers are an important part of all Shinto rituals, and this can range from the formal Norito prayers, which we'll be getting into a bit later. These are read by priests. They very often come from the Kojiki and are in classical Japanese that is not understood to the average Japanese person, or individual prayers given by the average Japanese person. And finally, the importance of feast. That's either eating the offerings that are first given to the kami and then shared with either priests, people requesting rituals, or a whole slew of worshippers, therefore a matsuri or something like that. And it really is building community, both with the kami, with whom you're sharing the food, and also with the other people that you're sharing the food with. And this is how a Shinto shrine can in some ways be considered like a parish. All right, now we get to Matsuri, the fun stuff. So you've had a taste of Matsuri already because of the reading you had on this past Friday on Okunchi, a particular Matsuri at Suwa Shrine in Nagasaki. But let's talk a little bit about Matsuri more generally, because this is probably most Japanese people's favorite part of Shinto. This is the thing they get most excited about and put a lot of time and effort into, and really does, form an important part of their not just regional, but also their neighborhood identity. A lot of Matsuri are organized around particular neighborhoods. So, in terms of what matsuri means, it comes from the verb matsuru, or to worship. But matsuri is usually translated as festival for a good reason. You'll also occasionally hear the term reisai, or you'll find certain matsuri end in the term sai. That's just another reading of the same character for matsuri. But it again shows that, while this is a festival, it really is one centered around worship. And how does it become worship? Well, some of the things we just talked about definitely appear in Matsuri. You usually have purification prayers said by priests, offerings of some sort, and then a feast. Matsuri are really all about food in some ways. But in terms of what this does, the function is to thank the kami, entertain them, again, keep the kami happy in order to gain their blessings, but also in terms of building community both around the shrine and within certain neighborhoods. And it's also really a very celebratory time. It's kind of a release from the everyday, sort of monotony of a work, school, etc. And there just tend to be, most people who have been to Matsuri will tell you that they tend to be a ton of fun. And one thing I do think it is worth noting is that participation in Matsuri, while it is something that everyone can participate in some way, some of the specific actions like carrying the mikoshi or another sacred object, or some of the purification rituals, sometimes those are limited just to men. And this is something that's slowly changing, not everywhere. For instance, in the picture on the right, the Dontosai, which is a festival of Osaki Hachimangu in Sendai, Miyagi, where, as you know, I spent some time. Until recently, this was limited only to men, but about a decade ago, they first opened it up to women, and then they also opened it up to foreigners to participate. I did not participate because this festival is one of the so-called naked festivals in Japan. As you can see, they're not exactly naked. They're wearing this, sort of clear, like white garb. And the women wear sort of light coats over that, but you are wearing very few clothing in the middle of January, and that was not for me. So Matsuri are not the only seasonal event, but they do also, sort of participate in these seasonal, forms of worship that are communal forms of Shinto practice. And so the biggest one, sort of the Japanese equivalent of Christmas, if you will, is the New Year's festival. That's when everyone goes home. A lot of Tokyo is empty because people are, home in the more countryside regions with their family. And so this is a few-day festival. It involves special food, but it also involves, for most Japanese families, the first shrine visit of the year. And this may be to the, local shrine, the shrine that the family, does most things at, or it could be to a particularly famous or large shrine in the area. Another important event is Setsubun in early February. That's well known for its phrase, Oni wa soto fuku wa uchi, which I've translated here, demons out, good luck in. So you have these great winter festivals that are sort of set throughout Japan. But Matsuri, it really depends on where you are and what the focus is. So as the textbook pointed out, you have sort of spring Matsuri that are centered around planting, particularly rice planting. Then you have summer festivals that are centered more around health and protection. Summer's a time where it's very hot and humid in Japan. There can be a lot of rains that can destroy crops, but also cause certain pestilences and diseases to flourish. The Gion Matsuri in Kyoto, extremely well known, was started in order to combat a plague that was going around Kyoto at the time. And then in the fall, of course, you have harvest festivals. And what you see here, the Taiko Matsuri, is one of those. Taiko Matsuri are very common in Shikoku, sort of the smallest of the big four islands of Japan. And this is an a photo that I actually took when I was living in Ehime and teaching English many years ago. You can see how young I was in that little photo there. But in this case, what's being held is not a mikoshi like we have before. Mikoshi are those portable shrines that can be carried around, but there are other things that can be carried around. In the case of the Taiko Matsuri, taiko is a kind of Japanese drum, and that's very elaborately decorated here, but that's what it is. Okay, and then another sort of aspect of Shinto practice is simply praying to the kami. And there's a specific way you do this when you go to a shrine, which is increasingly sort of illustrated both on articles like the one I took this image from, but also in shrines. They'll have signs that sort of tell you how to do this. And what you need to do first, well, someone say what you need to do first is throw some money in there, in that sort of trough that you see in front of the shrine altar. But what you need to do to sort of call on the kami, bring their attention to you, is to ring a bell. This big, sort of rope that you see there actually rings some bells. You bow twice, and you'll often see it noted that you need to bow at a 90-degree angle for 3 seconds. Japanese tend to take their bowing very seriously. So you bow twice, and then you pray, and then you clap twice, is the usual order. You'll see people play around with this, but so what are the subject of these prayers? If we return to this idea of Shinto as a this worldly religion, the subject of prayer is often tangible benefits, things you can achieve and certainly hope to achieve. A very common one is passing exams. You'll definitely see either backpack-shaped charms that people buy, or just lots of students in uniforms buying those particular charms or praying ardently. You can also pray to find love, find a husband, wife, whatever. Pregnancy and safe childbirth, there's another really common subject of prayer. Protection while driving, some would translate this as traffic safety, but it's really more something that you'll put, sort of in the car and keep with you. Prayers for business success, for avoiding all sorts of illnesses. Really, there are a lot of different things you can pray for, but these are among the most common ones. And it's worth noting that kamis specialize. There are, kami that are considered to be, the kami of poetry, the kami of, sort of avoiding illness and other things. But most kami can be approached about the vast majority of concerns. And here are some of the objects that you'll either find at a shrine or, of course, you can buy at a shrine. So one of them are these votive tablets, which are made of wood, on which you buy, of course, and then you write a message, either something you're hoping for, which could be something that's entirely out of your control, or something that you're working towards, and you sort of want the blessing of the kami as you continue that effort. On the right here, we see omamori, these sort of talismans or protective charms that you can buy for many of the, sort of common aspirations and prayers that I mentioned in the last slide. And in terms of what's the difference between emma and omamori, emma, first of all, are usually a little bit more expensive, and you do leave them at the shrine. You leave them in a particular place like that, and they, sort of purify and get rid of them and leave room for more. Omamori, in contrast, are something that you usually buy and take home with you. You might buy it for a friend or a family member. But these are, quite honestly, they're also just as much tourist items or souvenirs as much as they are religious talismans, but many people do believe in them and buy them quite regularly or for, again, specific needs. Hamaya, you're a little less likely to see at every single shrine, or at least all the time, but it's something that many Japanese families buy around New Year's. They would take home and use the hamaya to sort of protect the house, and then they would renew it every year. In fact, all of these, both the talismans and the hamaya, are something that you would be expected to renew. It only sort of holds the blessing of the kami for so long. And finally, there are these omikuji, or fortunes. They're, something that you buy at the shrine, and then you read, see what your luck is supposed to be. And whether it's good luck or bad luck, you're supposed to tie it, again, at a very specific designated place at the shrine. It can be the branches of a certain tree or a particular pole laid out, but you tie it up and, again, leave it. You don't take that home with you. Okay, so now that we've covered some of these key, beliefs, rituals, and prayer, I wanted to make a few notes about mythology, because we'll be working on that at the end of this week in your group work. So what's very key about a lot of the Shinto mythology is that it is the basis for many of these beliefs. And so we see, for instance, purification and pollution appearing really prominently in these early myths. We also, see the myths sort of setting the tone for how you approach the kami, that worshiping the kami correctly gets you what you want. Again, this focus on tangible results, and on, sort of getting a clear, sort of benefit from the kami. So you'll find again and again in these myths that if there's some sort of problem, you figure out what kami is getting in your way and you worship them. In some cases, you build a shrine for them, and then they're happy and they support you. And another thing we see early on, particularly in the myth of Amaterasu going into the rock cave, arguably the most famous myth in Japanese mythology, is that sacred dance counts as an offering, and that the kami, again, like to be entertained. So these are some things to be on the lookout as we go towards the mythology. I also wanted to emphasize that the mythology we have from early Japan is by and large the mythology of the Yamato ruling clan. Again, we'll get to Japanese history a little bit later, but the myths that we're looking at all come from the Kojiki, which is the first sort of mythology and history text in Japan. It's actually the first text ever written in Japanese, and it's from the early 8th century, as you see here. It was also directly commissioned by the emperors in order to sort of record, mythology and history, but it's also very clearly from their view. You can see that the particular clan gods of the Yamato ruling family, notably Amaterasu, are the highest level of gods. And this is in part because the Yamato ruling clan derives their legitimacy from the fact that they descend from Amaterasu as the highest kami. That's what gives them their right to rule, and that's one thing that makes the adoption of Buddhism into Japan sort of complicated. How can the ruling family continue to rule when they're descended from the kami? And that's something they'll figure out and solve, but one thing I do want to mention is that this is the very same imperial family that you have in Japan today. There, of course, have been some movements towards, particular branches over the course of its very long history, but it is the longest reigning, sort of monarchy. Now it's a constitutional monarchy in the world. So this mythology still, sort of resonates in really important ways today. Okay, so just to briefly go over our readings and video for this week. So on Monday, or by the time you're watching this presumably, you'll have 2 more chapters from Shinto Simple Guides on many of the things I just talked about, although, reader and I emphasize different things. On Thursday, you'll have a reading from a pamphlet. In fact, you'll be reading the entire pamphlet from this particular priest. Sonoda Minoru is a priest at Chichibu Shrine and is also a scholar of Shinto. He's a professor at Kyoto University, and he wrote this pamphlet in English that's, sort of talking about Shinto and what it is, and, also gives his reflections on particular issues, everything from Japan's imperial past to Shinto's relationship with nature, all that sort of thing. On Friday, we'll do group work on some of the foundational myths of Shinto, which is why I had this, sort of brief introduction to mythology in the slide before now. And in terms of the video for this week, there's a wonderful playlist of Matsuri on YouTube. So choose with whichever Matsuri you're interested in, maybe watch a few. This will get you acquainted with, again, sort of this category of Matsuri and all the things Matsuri can be and mean. And to leave you with just a couple of questions, one will be, based on the video, what Matsuri have you seen, either in Japan or over video, and what did you notice about them? What stood out to you? How do Shinto events and Matsuri reflect an appreciation for nature? What aspects of these particular rituals, sort of demonstrate belief in the importance of nature and the seasons and whatnot? When you get to the pamphlet by Professor Sonoda, consider how he, as a Shinto priest and as a scholar, imagined Shinto's role in human life, in nature, in the world today. And finally, how do myths serve to, sort of emphasize key Shinto ideas and explain why things are the way they are? That is something that myths very often do. But where do we see, sort of Shinto, even as it's practiced today, coming out of these myths? What's the connection? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on Thursday.